Good evening, and welcome to the 26th Annual Leonard J. Arrington Mormon History Lecture. I'm Jennifer Duncan, Interim Dean of Libraries here at Utah State University. Before we get started this evening, I would like to read a brief statement acknowledging the history of the place in which we are gathered tonight. As a land-grant institution, Utah State University and all in-state campuses and centers reside on the territories of the 8 tribes of Utah, who have been living, working, and residing on this land from time immemorial. These tribes are the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Indians, Navajo Nation, Ute Indian Tribe, Northwestern Band of Shoshone, Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, San Juan Southern Paiute, Skull Valley Band of Goshute, and White Mesa Band of Ute, Ute Mountain Ute. We acknowledge the historical context behind a painful history of genocide, forced removal, and dispossession of tribal peoples' lands on which USU exists. We acknowledge these lands on which we gather carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. We recognize elders, past and present, as peoples who have cared for and continue to care for the land. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty, history, experiences, and resiliency of the Native peoples who are still here today. I am so happy that you're all able to join us here on the Utah State University campus this evening. As many of you know, tonight's lecture had to be postponed last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are so grateful that we were able to coordinate with our speaker, Dr. Laurie Maffly-Kipp, to reschedule for this fall. Many of you will also recognize that we have relocated the lecture this year from its traditional home in the historic Logan Tabernacle due to the planned seismic upgrade construction on that building. Thank you all for being willing to come up the hill and join us to campus for this year, maybe the next year or two, we're not quite sure, while we wait for that project to be completed. Now I'd like to pass the podium over to my colleague, Dr. Patrick Mason, the Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture, to introduce Dr. Maffly-Kipp.
Thank you, Dean Duncan, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. It's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce this year's Arrington lecturer, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Laurie Maffly-Kipp. Laurie Maffly-Kipp is the Archer Alexander Distinguished Professor of Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, where she also currently serves as interim vice provost and dean of the graduate school. She earned her BA at Amherst College and her PhD in American history at Yale University. She taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for about a quarter century, many of those years were spent as chair of the Department of Religious Studies, before moving to Washington University to join the prestigious faculty of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. During her illustrious career, she has served as president of the American Society of Church History and the Mormon History Association, and has received numerous fellowships and grants from such institutions as the Lilly Endowment, the National Humanities Center, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dr. Maffly-Kipp's research and teaching focuses on African American religions, global Mormonism, religion on the Pacific borderlands of the Americas, and intercultural contact. Her numerous publications include the books Religion and Society in Frontier California, published by Yale University Press, Practicing Protestants, Studies in American Christian History, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, Proclamation to the People, 19th Century Mormonism and the Pacific Basin Frontier, by University of Utah Press, Setting Down the Sacred Past, African American Race Histories by Harvard University Press, and Women's Work, From Antebellum America to the Harlem Renaissance by Oxford University Press. Particularly germane to tonight's discussion are 2 other publications of hers. The Book of Mormon, which, no, Laurie did not write, but she did write the introduction to Penguin Classics' 2008 edition of the book, and the anthology American Scriptures, also published by Penguin, which collects 15 scriptural texts produced in the United States from the late 18th to the early 20th centuries, including excerpts from the Book of Mormon. Her interest in Mormon scripture and Mormonism is therefore long and deep. She's currently working on books about Mormonism in Asia and the South Pacific, and global Mormonism more generally. In addition to being an internationally renowned scholar, Dr. Maffly-Kipp has also been the mentor, formally and informally, of many of the top scholars in the field of American religion and Mormon history. I have personally frequently benefited from her sage advice and have seen the ways that she brings out the best in the people around her. Laurie is known far and wide, not only for her analytical brilliance, which you'll see on display tonight, but also for her warmth, her generosity, her wisdom, and her sense of humor. In short, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Laurie Maffly-Kipp as this year's Arrington lecturer, so please join me in welcoming her here to Utah State University.
Wow, that's a hard act to follow, whoever that woman is who you were describing. It's really such a pleasure to be here. It's been a long time in the making. Maybe anticipation will make it even better for you, I hope so. It's such a pleasure to be traveling again, to be in a room with real-life people again for the first time. This is my first lecture since the pandemic started that I've been able to deliver in person, so I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to try not to drop this water, so I'm going to put it on the floor, I think, for right now. First of all, I just want to thank Patrick for his lovely introduction, Jennifer Duncan for hosting this, Trina Shelton for all of the work she did on arranging a lovely dinner, and everything else about this. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be here in Logan. In the summer of 1960, Glenn T. Fisher, the outgoing mission president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in South Africa, began the long journey home from the field. Because of the church's longstanding ban on temple work among members of Black African descent, which is often referred to as the priesthood ban, although it affected both males and females, the South African mission was at that point the only outpost of LDS Church activity on the continent. Established in the 1850s as an outreach to those of European descent, the African mission had kept the evangelization of Black Africans at a cautious arm's length. But beginning in the years after World War II, word filtered back that Christians in Nigeria and Ghana were requesting literature and guidance from church leadership about how to establish Mormon churches in their regions. Reports were sketchy, but some estimates from their native correspondents placed the number of congregants in these unofficial Mormon churches in the thousands. At a loss to know what to do, given the priesthood ban, President David O. McKay commissioned Fisher to stop through on a brief trip and pursue the matter. Were these potential church members sincere, he wondered? And just because I have this fancy laser pointer, I can show you that he's down here. So he's going up to this area. Nigeria and Ghana are there. You'll note that in 1960, Ghana, over here, had been an independent country for a couple of years. Nigeria was on the cusp of becoming independent from Great Britain. Years later, Fisher reminisced about his visit to West Africa, recalling his impressions of the churches in Nigeria that had aligned themselves with the Mormon faith. The communities are very poor, he noted, and the churches have neither seats, musical instruments, nor even a pulpit. As he put it, the leader of the group carried his supplies in a wooden box, which he used as a pulpit. Supplies consisted of a few Bibles, some missionary pamphlets, the Articles of Faith by James E. Talmage, and A Marvelous Work and a Wonder by LeGrand Richards. On further inspection, he found the same pattern and the same reading material in other churches. In only one did he spy a copy of the Book of Mormon. From this literature, he said, a church organization had been effected, patterned after the Mormon Church. The same sorts of events were taking place in neighboring Ghana. Joseph Kwame Dadzier, one of the first self-styled Mormons there, wrote to Lamar Williams in the missionary department in Salt Lake City in the early 1960s, requesting more information about the church. Williams responded and shipped him copies of A Marvelous Work and a Wonder, Gospel Principles, and several other books. Around the same time, Raphael A.F. Mensah, a Ghanaian visiting the United Kingdom, received some church pamphlets from Lillian Clark, a woman he had met there. She herself was not a church member, but she gladly shared the literature with him. Mensah, armed with his pamphlets and additional books provided by the missionary department, began preaching about the Mormon faith to his friends and neighbors, eventually forming several congregations of yet unofficial Mormon churches. In 1964, Mensah was joined by W.J.B. or Billy Johnson, who teamed up with Mensah in preaching and conducting meetings, and you see the two of them here. Together, they founded religious gatherings of nearly 1,000 members. Now, what was going on here? And even more urgently, what could the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the one in Utah, do to protect its name and guard the boundaries of its beliefs? From its beginnings, Christianity has witnessed struggles over who can claim its mantle as the true form of belief. And the Salt Lake-based church in 1960, having worked for decades to assure its status as a legitimate American religious tradition, and focusing its international efforts on standardization of doctrines and practices, did not want to see its hard efforts threatened by renegade believers assuming its name. Even more concerning was that word had spread beyond Salt Lake City about the West African self-styled Mormons. In June 1965, Time magazine published a brief article about the phenomenon. Its author recounted that from the early 1950s, circulating books and tracts had been sent from church headquarters to Nigerian seekers. By latest count, these Mormon churches had 75 elders and branches in 6 cities. Estimates at that time put their numbers at approximately 10,000 baptized adults and 6,000 children. All this phenomenal growth had occurred without benefit of US-based LDS missionaries, since the Nigerian government would not grant them resident visas. As the widely circulated magazine pointed out, in the absence of US oversight, the Nigerian Mormons had established their own, quote, black hierarchy, priests and all. Annie Dick Obat, the bishop presiding over the Nigerian elders, responded to questions about the legitimacy of this church structure by asserting that he did not, quote, have to wait for revelation to know that I am the natural head in Nigeria. Nigerian priests will run their own branch. This is their creation, and they are in their own country. Now, all these events are interesting in and of themselves, and historians such as James B. Allen, Russell Stevenson, Greg Prince, and Dimitri Hurlbut have provided rich detail about the anxieties expressed by President McKay, Glenn Fisher, Lamar Williams, and other LDS church leaders in this era. They have analyzed why West Africans might have found their church a desirable home, and how transatlantic negotiations were shaped by the politics of race within the US domestic context. My concern here relates to these developments, but it also attempts to shift our focus onto the self-styled Mormons themselves. I hope this will allow us to better understand not the why of conversion, but the how. How did West Africans in this era fashion collective religious systems out of textual fragments and personal testimony? Thus, this is less an institutional story, although it is related to institutions, and more an exploration of the lived faith as experienced by those on the ground. What did this self-styled Mormonism look like? And how did believers craft churches out of the bare materials of tracts and inspirational volumes? This talk explores the circulation and interpretation of this homegrown Mormon faith in the 1960s and 1970s, and concludes with the dilemmas raised by this religious self-fashioning for LDS Church establishment after 1978. In other words, what does it mean to read Mormonism in West Africa? This is also a story about reading in another sense. Utah church leaders were also trying to decipher first the intentions and later the religious practices of West African Mormons. In this regard, they were shaped as much by their own domestic context as were their transatlantic counterparts. They understood their exchanges with Nigerians and Ghanaians through the lenses of racial politics in the United States, as well as through their own aspirations for acceptance on the American religious scene. One more word by way of clarification and introduction. Throughout my remarks, I use the terms Mormon and Mormonism, and I do so for at least two reasons. First, this is a historical exploration, and these were the terms used at the time. The two most well-known circulating texts sent to West Africa that I mentioned above were James E. Talmage's Articles of Faith and LeGrand Richards' A Marvelous Work and a Wonder. Both authors consistently use these terms to describe their faith and enjoin others to embrace the description. Talmage, one of the most prolific LDS writers of the 20th century, published multiple volumes with the term Mormonism in the title, referring to the faith that he sought to explain and defend. LeGrand Richards' work, in turn, was originally published in the 1930s as a series of lessons for missionaries entitled The Message of Mormonism. In turn, these are the terms that came to West Africa in those original shipments of pamphlets and books, and they most accurately capture the identities embraced by believers there. Second, I also use these terms because we are describing here multiple traditions under a Mormon tent. Obviously, there has been and continues to be contestation over which traditions are legitimate, authorized, or correct. And it is precisely this contestation that is part of the story. Understanding self-styled Mormonism in this era requires that we begin with the stories of believers. Anthony Uzodimma Obinna described his journey to Mormon faith in his own words. Thank you, so I won't kick over my water. Thank you. He described his journey to Mormon faith in his own words. Born in 1928 in southeastern Nigeria, Obinna was an ethnic Igbo whose family observed traditional Igbo customs, including the practice of polygamy. In his recollections, Obinna explains that his people, quote, detested Western education and hated anyone who talked to them about sending their children to school or taking them to church. Nonetheless, as the fifth of 24 children, he was sent to school to learn English. Apparently, his father decided that someone had to be able to speak and write the language, after which he became a teacher. His studies continued with correspondence courses from Oxford, England, in English, geography, economics, and history. Beginning in the mid-1960s, Obinna explains that he had a series of dreams. In the first one, he encountered a tall man in white shorts who asked him whether he knew about Christianity, and specifically about Christian and Christiana in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. He replied that he had read it, but had forgotten it, so the old man told him to reread it. Several months later, in another dream, the personage took him to a, quote, most beautiful building and showed him everything in it. The man appeared to him 3 times in all. Several years later, Obinna continues, placing his account during the Nigerian Civil War of the late 1960s, he picked up an old copy of the Reader's Digest for September 1958 and opened it to find a picture of the building from his dream that accompanied an article called The March of the Mormons. From the time I finished reading this story, he recalled, I had no rest of mind any longer. My whole attention was focused on my new discovery. I rushed out immediately to tell my brothers, who were all amazed and astonished to hear the story. Compelled by his dreams and the remarkable coincidence of this image, Obinna also wrote to LDS Church headquarters, requesting instructions and more literature. And here began his journey in the Mormon faith, which would culminate after 1978 with his baptism into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, Obinna's story is perhaps the best known account from this era, but it is far from the only one. Lamar Williams, who worked in the church missionary department in the early 1960s, recalled receiving over 1,000 letters from West Africans requesting literature during this period. Along with Glenn Fisher's brief visit, Williams also visited West Africa several times in the first years of the decade. But brief, sporadic site visits from Utah could not provide the sustained attention needed to recreate an official version of church practice on African soil. By default, the readiest conduit for information about Mormon teachings was through pamphlets and popularized interpretations of the faith. Distance and inability to embark on sustained missionary activity were not the only reasons for disconnection. Language, education, and lack of resources also played important roles. Although English was the official language of both Nigeria and Ghana by virtue of their history as colonial possessions of Great Britain, it was typically not the first language of native peoples. Instead, they tended to learn some rudimentary English in school, at least those who were allowed to go to school by their families. But their primary languages were determined by localized tribal groups, Twi, Ga, Ewe, Ibibo, or one of many other regional groupings. This basic fissure of language capabilities had multiple implications for self-styled Mormons who picked up books to learn about the faith. Most fundamentally, it meant that Mormonism initially was a religion passed along by people who, like Anthony Obinna, exercised a high degree of English literacy. In the years following Ghanaian independence in 1957, the state established a program of universal education, much of which was provided through religious organizations, such as Methodist or Catholic schools. Ebau Garte, another early self-styled Mormon, observed that these schools were still steeped in the educational systems of British colonialism, and thus they placed great emphasis on the humanities and traditions of British literature. Many of the first local Mormon leaders were trained in these settings and thereby were provided with comprehensive education in English texts. They were encouraged to continue their education in Europe or the United States, thereby solidifying their skills in both the English language and the values of Western societies. It is no wonder, then, that Obinna's revelation and the message from his spiritual visitor to reread John Bunyan's classic Puritan text, A Pilgrim's Progress, resonated so deeply and propelled him toward the church. It linked his previous immersion in texts with revelations of a Mormon future. The experiences of Ebenezer Owusu-Ansah emphasized just how deeply the love of reading as a form of religious enthusiasm motivated the early Mormon converts in West Africa, and the close connections between education and conversion. Owusu-Ansah was from Kumasi in the Ashanti region of Ghana, which is traditionally a majority Muslim area. He described himself as a voracious reader who at the age of 16 began reading about all sorts of religious traditions. He was confused about which was the true church, note the connection and the parallels to Joseph Smith Jr.'s understandings. Finally, he began reading the Bible, and he read straight through from Genesis through Isaiah. Still, he hadn't found the answer to his question, so he moved from there directly on to the New Testament. It was only when he reached the book of Revelation and the prophecies of the Second Coming that his interest was piqued. He claims to have read that book multiple times. While he did not join the church in this period, he finally met up with some missionaries later on. In fact, he thought they were twins because they had suits with name tags on. They read aloud to him from the Book of Mormon, and he recalls that he was touched by it. So really, I'm a convert of the Book of Mormon. I was converted by what I read in the Book of Mormon, which really means by what they read to me in the Book of Mormon. After joining the church, he was determined to read all the Institute manuals and as much other church literature as he could get his hands on. After his stint at the MTC, he vowed to read the Book of Mormon 24 times during the following 2 years. Claims that instead he read it 25 times. Now, apparently, he's up to 43 times. I can't get along without the book, he said. These experiences also point to a second feature of early West African Mormonism. It was deeply and indelibly shaped by prior familiarity with the Bible. Now, this is true of Mormonism throughout the world, that those, and it's long been known, that those people who have already had encounters with Christianity are more likely to sort of transition easily to the Mormon faith. As Ibo Garte put it, almost all of us were Christians before. I've known Bible stories all my life, and a lot of people have, so it makes sense in our culture. In reading through the letters of West Africans to Lamar Williams in the missionary department, one enters a world that is utterly saturated with biblical phrasing, images, and metaphors. The Reverend Udo Ete, writing to Lamar Williams in 1960, sprinkled his letters with scriptural verses. He did not so much quote the Bible as he referenced it, citing Acts chapter 16, verse 9, or Daniel chapter 2, verse 3, assuming that his reader would readily understand his shorthand. This style indicates just how thoroughly steeped in the world of the Bible many West Africans were and are to this day. I don't know if you can see this. These are actually pictures I took on a trip several years back to Ghana. And you can see everything from stores named after biblical verses to just, it's everywhere. It is on billboards. It surrounds you in that culture. Udo Ete was himself the founder of a Christian church, the Prayer Church Mission, and his stylistic use of the Bible, along with his frequent interjections in his writings of amen and praise the Lord, also suggest the charismatic or spirit-filled nature of his faith. The biblical focus of West African cultures also meant that believers measured the worth of the Book of Mormon by how it measured up to their interpretations of the Bible, just as was true among the first Mormon converts in the antebellum United States. Juliana Amoa Kapente, when asked what led to her Mormon faith, recalled that initially she, quote, hated this church because of the Book of Mormon. I said, I don't like any church that uses 2 Bibles at the same time, so I didn't like this church. It wasn't until she visited, and perhaps more important, when she recognized the similarities of the stories of the Book of Mormon to those in the Bible, that she changed her mind. She described how the missionaries she later met would read alternate passages in the 2 books. And eventually she realized, quote, they are all the same thing, so I realized it was a good book. However, she also commented that she hadn't really studied it very much. Amoa Kapente, like other Bible-believing West Africans, measured the truth of Mormonism by the yardstick of the Bible. But this sometimes served as an initial impediment to accepting it. Mormonism, in other words, had to measure up. And even then, there's little indication of reading the Book of Mormon, of sitting down and reading the Book of Mormon. There is, in fact, relatively little mention of the Book of Mormon among early self-styled church members. The reasons for this, I think, are relatively straightforward. If language was a barrier for many who lacked facility in English, it is likely that the Book of Mormon, with its language that draws on the King James-style phrasing, proved an even more impenetrable text. Grant Hardy has argued persuasively that the idioms and archaic word forms of the King James Bible are difficult for many native English speakers to grasp, much less people with only a moderate command of the language. While he concedes that the King James Bible is too deeply rooted in LDS history and too connected to latter-day revelations to simply abandon, its exclusive usage can be an impediment to the acceptance of the faith. The less literate West Africans, then, would have had to do a double translation, since the Book of Mormon was not available in their native tongues. Indeed, the Book of Mormon was barely available to them at all in written form, despite the best efforts of Lamar Williams to ship off hundreds of materials to his correspondents. And church members in West Africa were in no financial position to buy and ship their own books. When BYU professor and businessman Lynn Hilton made a visit to Cape Coast, Ghana in 1969, he met with Mormon church members who had heard he would be in the country and who sought him out. They showed him their modest church building, Quote, "It was a mud architecture building, only 1 story high," Hilton remembered. "And there was a sign over the door that said, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Accra, Ghana branch. They took us inside, and there were rough lumber benches, a dirt floor, as I recall. They also showed Hilton their one well-used copy of the Book of Mormon. You could tell that literally thousands of people had gone through that book and licked their fingers," Hilton said. In a post-pandemic era, that just doesn't sound the same. All the corners were rounded and dark-colored and so dog-eared that the pages fanned out. The cover of the book was actually standing. His hosts explained to him that each person was allowed just a few minutes with the book. Then it was passed on to the next person to read. The book, they said, was being used and read around the clock and week after week. Early church members from the 1960s and early 70s more frequently comment on hearing stories from the Book of Mormon retold by the more educated church leaders, who would make their readings decipherable to those unable to comprehend the complex English. Joseph Kwame Dacier joined another self-styled Mormon church under the direction of Rebecca Mould in the late 1960s in Cape Coast. He recalled that Mould would not read from the Book of Mormon, but she occasionally talked about it and described its origins. She would also refer to biblical prophecies that presaged the Book of Mormon and would read from the Bible, thereby enabling her listeners to bring together biblical teachings with the Mormon Testament of Jesus Christ. He also noted that, quote, "Anybody who could read and understand the gospel was given the chance to preach." The lack of resources, which is still the case today in many smaller towns and villages in West Africa, dramatically circumscribed how Mormonism was communicated and disseminated. Dacier's recollections also point to a final reality of the language barrier imposed in the early years of self-styled West African Mormonism. Simply put, for those who wanted to read about the tradition, which most did, since that was one of the few conduits to information about the faith, it was much easier to understand what was written about it in Look magazine, Reader's Digest, The Improvement Era, or the words of James Talmage or LeGrand Richards than it was to understand the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants straight from the English language versions. Written in simpler language, and often even in a folksy manner, these works were geared toward broader audiences. It should not surprise us to see James Talmage's and LeGrand Richards' works showing up in even the unlikeliest of places. Theirs were the top 2 best-selling books in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints outside of the standard works, and were expressly made for missionary activity. Talmage's Articles of Faith has gone through over 50 English language editions alone since 1899. Richards' A Marvelous Work and a Wonder, long a staple of the approved missionary library, has sold upwards of 3 million copies and has appeared in several dozen languages. Indeed, some of the observers have quipped that LeGrand Richards brought more people to the Mormon faith than any other church member of the 20th century. He was a missionary at heart, having served in the Netherlands from 1905 to 1908 and returning there as presiding elder during the First World War. After that, he rose swiftly through the church system, being tasked by the leadership to serve as the Hollywood stake president and then as the presiding president over the Southern States Mission in the late 1930s. It was during his tour in the South that he composed his most notable work, a series of lessons for missionaries that he later revised as A Marvelous Work and a Wonder and published in 1950. More surprising, perhaps, was the popularity of the Improvement Era and Reader's Digest articles among West Africans. Mentions of the Reader's Digest appear to focus on one article in particular, the 1958 piece that Anthony Obinna referred to as the March of the Mormons, but whose correct title was The Mormon Church, A Complete Way of Life. You'll recall that Obinna was astonished that the building shown within that article had appeared to him in a dream. It was because of this miraculous coincidence that he knew Mormonism was the correct religion for him. Adewole Ogunmokun in Port Harcourt reported a similar response to the same article. After reading it, he recalled, I became transformed, and for a number of days I dreamt dreams of various degrees about the Mormon Church. I have even worshiped in the great temple with thousands of other brethren on more than one occasion, until I became convinced that I was not only dreaming, but seeing visions of new hope coming to my nation and Africa as a whole through the Mormon Church. The author of that article, Hartzell Spence, was an experienced journalist and author of books that brought romantic historical narratives, pride in American military and corporate success, and models of upstanding religious communities to broader reading audiences. One reviewer characterized his work on the discovery of the Amazon as, quote, an idealistic, adventurous, thrilling tale. I don't think that was a compliment at the time. Hartzell was the son of a Methodist preacher from Iowa, and he promoted all the values of patriotism, democracy, and free enterprise that infused 1950s American life. He approached the successes of the Mormons with the same wonder and admiration. Similarly, the improvement era of the late 1950s and early 1960s reflected a nearly exclusive focus on national, regional, and local success. Its pages also promoted church teachings, yes, but it is unstated elements of its pages that are most intriguing for our purposes. In images of blonde, blue-eyed families, in subject matter regarding American domestic patterns and consumption, and in the advertising localized to the Mormon culture region, these journals give little indication of how Mormonism might be lived out in urban settings, much less in developing nations. Now, I admit that it would be easy to make fun of these issues, looking back from the vantage of more than a half century. As we regard them from our post-civil rights, post-Vietnam War, post-everything vantage, these images look intensely parochial, unvaryingly white, and entirely uncritical about the complexities of American exceptionalism. Yet the fact remains that when Lamar Williams showed up in West Africa in 1961, having toted his flannel board for teaching purposes across the Atlantic Ocean, he finally met with one of his correspondents, Honesty John Akon. Akon, he described, lived in a mud hut, and his walls were decorated with clippings from the improvement era and pictures of the general authorities. So this brings us again to the question, what did these people read in Mormonism? What did it offer to them? What was its promise? And how did they find its meaning within the pages of periodical literature, missionary texts, and sometimes secondhand interpretations of difficult texts written in languages they barely knew? I think the answer to these questions is complex, and it cannot be entirely explained without understanding not just the Mormonism they were receiving in the books and pamphlets, but the religious and political contexts in which they lived. Remember that church leaders back in Utah were also trying to read this new Mormonism through the few signs they had available to them in the letters they received. They wanted to know whether the West Africans who were writing to them were sincere. They worried that perhaps they were only looking for financial support or some other form of handout rather than authentic faith. Church leaders were skeptical, worried because, as Marvin Jones said, it is so hard to tell what their underlying motives are, sincerity or want of finance. But these questions represent, I think, a false choice in the West African context. West Africans lived in an environment in which authentic faith was deeply embedded in gestures of material reciprocity and visions of worldly success. The Bible spoke to Christians in this region as a book that promised abundance and victory. Paul Gifford, one of the foremost scholars of Christianity in Ghana, reminds us that Ghana was the first independent nation in sub-Saharan Africa. Although the country was already very Christianized, some 60% of the population claims to be Christian, with sizable numbers of Roman Catholics, mainline Protestants, Pentecostals, and African independent churches, the face of Christianity changed rapidly in the years after independence and underwent what he calls a radical modernization centered on prayer, faith healing, and prosperity. This new charismatic faith was multinational and drew for support from young leaders trained in theology and supported by organizations in the United States. That material ballast was crucial in the face of extreme poverty. Quote, "This Christianity is about success," Gifford explains, especially in finance and material achievement. It is led by charismatic leaders, self-styled prophets who are specially anointed. They rely on their followers for money and in turn help their congregants in times of need. We see an example of this in the life and work of one of the most successful charismatic Christian preachers of the last few decades, Benson Andrew Idahosa, also known as the father of Pentecostalism in Nigeria. Oops, that's not him. Oh, that's a few meeting house. Sorry, I forgot to show you those pictures. The self-styled meeting house in Cape Coast, Ghana, and some of its leaders. There he is. This is Idahosa, also known as the father of Pentecostalism in Nigeria. Idahosa founded the Church of God Mission International in 1968, and immediately the movement began spreading through affiliation with church bodies in surrounding countries. 30 years later, the Church of God Mission was reported to be one of the 6 largest churches in the world, with approximately 7 million members. Idahosa also benefited greatly from affiliation with U.S. churches. He briefly attended the Christ for the Nations Institute in 1971, an independent Pentecostal college in Dallas, Texas. And he later received generous financial support from well-known independent Pentecostal preachers in the United States, including his mentors Gordon and Frida Lindsay, healing evangelist T.L. Osborne, and televangelist Jim Baker. The church also operates the All Nations for Christ Bible Institute, probably the most popular and influential Bible school in West Africa, one that sends out preachers to plant new independent Pentecostal churches throughout West Africa. At the same time, West Africans, newly independent from a British colonial past, were also forging new political futures for themselves in a world in which superpowers and alliances held the key to continued success. Dmitry Hurlbut has pointed out that new African nations needed allies with whom to affiliate, and seeking affiliation and support was a common social tool in post-independence West Africa. All of these features, then, may help us look at the letters written to Lamar Williams and others in a different light. Many West African writers, indeed, use the words affiliation and material support to describe their goal. Udo Ette put it this way: in fact, that was what we want. That is, to affiliating our church group with a truthful missions board whose entire seeking it to do the full will of God. Honesty John Akang even stressed that if the Utah church could not help them, perhaps they could refer them to someone else. Please, dear brother in Christ, kindly refer us to some other missionary bodies over there for affiliation. Now, this is not to say that West Africans were not earnestly looking for a true set of doctrines or a correct church in terms of their beliefs. But it does imply that they did not separate material abundance and authentic faith in quite the way that Utah church leaders understood or could respond to. And it suggests, moreover, that the letters reaching out to the LDS Church may not have been the only letters sent from West African church leaders, who sought partnerships for both their growing church bodies as well as their new national project. During an inrush of U.S. missionary groups in the post-colonial era, Africans saw these groups as potential allies in the many material, political, and religious struggles that they faced. Another important consideration in understanding these letters is the recognition that West Africans did not necessarily hold the same views about church exclusivity that LDS church members did. West African Christians tended to move freely among Christian churches, seeing their affiliation as a way to align with communities that offered the most promising collaborations. They needed schools, buildings, and books, and ministers needed a living, which they hoped such partnerships might provide. Yet their tribal and familial connections were so closely tied to their original religious identities that conversion to a new church did not necessarily mean renunciation of what had come before. One could ill afford to give up any friends during a storm. R.A.F. Mensah, one of the first converts in Ghana that was mentioned previously, was raised in a household surrounded by both Christian and Ahmadiyya relations. Ahmadiyya is a form of Islam that began in late 19th century India. Get the right page. It tends to be spirit-filled and features a strong belief in angels and revelations, much like the charismatic Christian churches in West Africa at the time. Mensa eventually converted to Methodism, then joined the Seventh-day Adventist. According to Russell Stevenson, Mensa, quote, Mensa associated with many churches, hoping to receive a living. He never did abandon any of the churches he associated with. In similar fashion, Juliana Amoa Kapente grew up in an apostolic Pentecostal church, the Divine Healing Church of Christ, then moved to the medieval church mission. Only after that did she join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. These patterns of serial affiliation or multiple affiliation were extremely common among early West African Mormons. And as one of the people that I talked to when I was visiting in Ghana said, you know, if someone is raised in a tribe that happens to be Presbyterian, even if they join another church, if you ask them what they are, they'll say they're Presbyterian. So it's very complicated in ways that I think are sort of not easily understood by us in particular in the United States. At the same time, Utah leaders read their interactions with West Africans through the lenses of their own domestic concerns. Lamar Williams had planned a return trip to Nigeria in November 1962, but racial politics back home delayed it. George Romney was running a campaign for the governorship of Michigan, and church officials were worried that if Williams embarked on a tour and began baptizing Black African church members, it might be seen as an attempt to help Romney's campaign for governor. So he delayed the trip. A few years later, an African newspaper, the Nigerian Outlook, published a piece by a Nigerian visiting California. Apparently, the visitor had visited an LDS ward and started to do some research on the temple ban. In response, he sent a scathing letter back to Nigeria, excoriating the Mormons for their racism that he likened to South African apartheid. For U.S. church leaders, the issue was domestic and localized, and this press jeopardized their work among African Americans back home. While they had yet to see this as an international, even a Pan-African form of racial protest in which Nigerians were struggling to make their claims in a post-colonial environment, clearly some West Africans framed it this way. As a result, Utah leaders pulled back once again on outreach to Nigeria, and Lamar Williams waited still longer to visit his African correspondents. Of course, in the meantime, as we know, the Mormon churches in Ghana and Nigeria continued to develop their own customs and practices. Now, these readings and misreadings of intent across fragmented lines of communication, in sum, meant that the self-styled Mormon churches that arose in West Africa in the 1960s took on a decidedly localized flavor. They were inflected by the spirit-filled worship of growing Pentecostal influences. They were hopeful for the material and spiritual promises of affiliation with U.S. religious organizations. Those members who joined tended to welcome the potential of American cultural capital to help them gain power within their own communities. So in this sense, the pages of the Improvement era make sense if one sees this as a kind of social power, as an aspirational social power that can be garnered and utilized in other contexts. As for religious practices, they embraced and lived out biblical language, but knew only the rudimentary details of the Book of Mormon and rarely quoted it. In the absence of direct guidance from Utah church members to standardize or correlate their teachings, they freely brought in charismatic practices to worship services, including dancing, singing, and extended prayers. Angelina Ajay recalled her aunt and uncle, who joined a congregation led by Rebecca Mold. She described singing, clapping, and dancing in worship services, punctuated by songs about Moroni sung in local languages. There would be a reckoning in 1978 and a campaign to retranslate the American Mormon tradition in West African settings. The dancing, drumming, and clapping were, in the Mormon terms, regularized. Rebaptisms needed to take place under the guidance of American missionaries. Ironically, those adaptations that allowed self-styled Mormonism to endure for nearly 20 years without American oversight were precisely those that needed to be extirpated for global affiliation to take place. West Africans had to choose between fully joining the Utah-based church and giving up local practices or moving to a different religious community. Many chose the latter. Angelina Ajai's grandmother rejoined the Methodist Church, while her grandfather became a leader in his Ghanaian ward. Most notable, alongside the cessation of charismatic practices, was the changed role of women leaders. Rebecca Mould had been known by her followers as Prophetess Rebecca, conforming to traditional patterns of women's authority in southern Ghanaian society. The first constitution of her self-styled Mormon church in 1969 made no mention of gender differences in terms of the priesthood, and women in this church and others like it led prayer groups and performed ritual cleansings and baptisms for both male and female congregants. At times, female authority was questioned. In 1972, male leaders apparently discussed a proposal to bar women from giving revelations and prophecies. But they did not pursue this option and instead instructed that dreams and revelations had to be reported to the pastor. Prophetess Rebecca was elected to a national high council of 12 apostles in 1972 with no dissent. The arrival of LDS missionaries in 1978 required delicate negotiation with this church leader. She also happened to own the building in which the congregation met. Initially, Rebecca welcomed the LDS missionaries and was one of the first baptized into the Young Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. President Spencer W. Kimball sent along a special commendation to her, and she was set apart as Relief Society president. Her title was changed to Mother Rebecca, although many followers continued to call her a prophetess, and she continued to occupy a prime seat on the dais in the front of the meeting house. Still, efforts to nudge her out of a position of spiritual authority began to chafe, and her leadership became less visible. The missionaries explained to her that the baptisms she had performed were not valid because they had to be conducted by a member of the priesthood. When those missionaries departed in late 1979, arguments broke out in the church as several male members tried to convince her to donate her building to the church. When she refused, she was accused of, quote, abusing the presidency, and soon thereafter she left the church to reclaim the title of independent church leader. While her role as prophetess Rebecca was relatively unusual, the circumstances surrounding her departure suggest that she was far from alone in wanting to retain women's ecclesiastical authority in the church. Her sister, Comfort Mould, had already split away and formed her own charismatic congregation. When Rebecca left the LDS Church, she took a substantial number of her followers with her and continued to use LDS Church materials. She continued to consider herself a Mormon. As she put it, "The Lord knows that I'm a Mormon. In my heart, I'm a Mormon. I'm a Latter-day Saint." Now, there's no easy lesson to draw from these stories. I've devoted much of my career, in fact, to understanding the cultural translation of religion from one place or group to another. Lamar Williams may have sent books and carried his flannel board. I love that image in my mind of him traveling the world with a flannel board. But transmission of texts, of values, of practices is a profoundly complex process, one that is utterly dependent on mutual recognition across multiple layers of hidden assumptions. What is sincere religion? What does it mean to become Mormon? What does it mean to affiliate? The simplest components of language, as known well by our textual experts here watching tonight, can take on dramatically different meanings in different contexts. True understanding, true communication entails a practice of critical empathy. Texts, in and of themselves, do not a religious community make. Thank you. Okay, it seems we have time for some questions. If I can see pretty well out there if anyone wants to comment or has a question about any of this or wants to correct me on something I got wrong. Yes? Where are we now? Boy, that's a great question. Yeah, I wanted to get all the way up to the present, and there's too much interesting stuff that I wanted to get through in the past, and I never quite made it. But I am thinking a lot about what has carried on in this and what has changed. I think the poverty is still a huge issue for the church in Ghana, the churches in Ghana and Nigeria. I mean, so much so that it's really difficult to come by just some of the basics that people need. And it's still the case that what draws a lot of young people to the church in the seminaries is, as they put it to me when I asked them, greener pastures. And again, that's both a spiritual and a very material kind of issue. They are looking for hope in their lives, and they see that as being both very sort of grounded in material realities, but also related to their ultimate salvation. And the church, in Ghana, in Accra, for example, seminaries are often one of the few places with reliable internet. So there were lots of students in there taking correspondence courses at BYU, Idaho, trying to get degrees, trying to sort of educate themselves. So there's a real hope and promise coming out there. There are still a lot of language issues. I went to a Relief Society meeting when I was there, and most of the women did not speak English. And the woman who was leading it was trying to do some translation as she went along, but they couldn't read. I mean, she had them sort of looking at particular texts, but she had to read the text to them. So there are some very basic issues. In fact, I mean, things that, for good reason, I think church leadership wouldn't necessarily know about. For example, I got there not long after the change from the 3-hour block to the 2-hour block had taken effect. And the people in this local ward I was visiting were really concerned about that because they said, we've set aside part of that block for language instruction. And if we can only do that once a month, that's going to be a real problem. They didn't want to curtail that. But people also, because they don't have cars, they can't get to church during the week. So they can't, they really need all that time on Sunday to sort of fit in all the things that they want to fit in. So there's some very basic logistical issues that arise that are just, I get it. If I were the head of a worldwide church, I don't know how I would anticipate all of the many logistical problems you'd have to deal with around the world. Mm-hmm. Now all of a sudden the hands are coming out. Okay, so first you, yes, you.
It's part of your question to answer a little bit. I spent 18 months in Lubumbashi, DRC, on a mission, and now I'm working with Pathway.
Uh-huh.
Worldwide, there's over 8,000. That was for last year, but I'm sure there's more now. Students throughout Africa who are participating in that. Internet is their huge challenge. The church has made the church building internet available to them, as you mentioned, at the seminaries in Ghana. The numbers are growing rapidly, and then these students are continuing on, as you mentioned, enrolling in BYU, Idaho, or Ensign College. They maintain the same tuition rate.
Right.
So in DRC, it is $5.50 for a credit hour. In Kenya, it is $7, Uganda, $6.50, and they can maintain that same low rate throughout their entire they won't get it done probably in 4 years, but accumulating their 120 credits needed to graduate from Ensign College or BYU, Idaho. The church is supporting Pathway in fabulous way. It's an amazing curriculum. And then there are other organizations from grassroots NGOs that are working to help provide computers for these students. You can Google that, or you might check out the Lord's Hands.
Thank you. Yeah.
Anyway, that is not connected with the church. That
Mm-hmm.
people are anxious to learn English. While I was there, I had over 400 students who would come through there on 3 different days to learn English.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So behind you there was another question. Yeah, the question is about whether they observe some of the practices of tithing and the word of wisdom that churches in the United States or other places would observe. In part, yes, not tithing so much. In part because the monetary system within Ghanaian churches is very different. Money is given to the pastor. Given to support the pastor. That's part of what I was trying to say. But the pastors are there to make a living, and they make it by getting contributions directly from their congregants. So no, because where would they? They wouldn't have sent the tithing, and they were localized, so they couldn't send the tithing anywhere else. Word of wisdom, yeah, there are mentions of that. I think it's probably coming from LeGrand Richards or Talmage, references to those things. And for example, for a lot of the Christians and for Muslims who converted, giving up alcohol was not, they already didn't drink alcohol. So some of those things seemed pretty natural to them and made a lot of sense. And I just didn't see a lot of mention, but the few mentions I saw were like, yeah, of course, the word of wisdom is a good thing and we observe it. Yes.
Thanks, Laurie.
Yeah.
The presentation, learned a lot. Did you find in the transition and or disruption that these folks sought other affiliations in the restoration, like the Unity of Christ, or did they consider kind of making their own connections that preserved the distinctives of their churches kind of within the country or within the continent?
You mean, did anyone think about setting up like an independent Mormon church in Nigeria or Ghana? I didn't see mention of that. The RLDS church did come in at certain points, and also, in fact, some of the letter writers talk about writing to the RLDS church too. So there was outreach. That's why I think the outreach, just from the hints I've seen, suggests that it's not just the church in Utah that they're writing to. And so that sort of changes your thought about, I think the church was interpreting it as they wanted the truth that only we had. And for some that might have been the case, but for some it was, we want affiliation. And we think you're a pretty good church, so we'll go along with that. And eventually they work themselves into, sort of closer connections. But I didn't see any independent, I don't think there was a kind of infrastructure to support that, nor did they know it well enough. Even the localized churches were somewhat different in their practices, and they were organized in much the same way that Pentecostal churches in Ghana are organized around particular leaders, right? So Prophetess Rebecca was the leader because she was charismatic, and she had a certain kind of gift, a spiritual gift. And that's the kind of organization they were more familiar with, I suspect.
And how did they navigate the political issue?
That's a great question. Well, initially, Lamar Williams talked a little bit about this because he was corresponding with someone about the polygamy issue. And when he went there in 1961, his journal is in the church history library, and he describes holding a series of meetings, and he said, I went there and we talked about polygamy, because most of the people there were polygamists. And I told them that this was not a good practice, and sort of tried it out. And then he describes, the next night I went there, and they wanted to talk about polygamy again. And like 3 nights in a row, he has to talk about polygamy. And after his visit, one of his correspondents writes to him and says, Dear Mr. Williams, I want you to know that I really want to join your church, and I'm willing to give up my other wives and only take my first wife. Now, the children are all mine because they're my as the father, they're my property. So I'm going to take all my children and my first wife and leave the other wives. And poor Lamar Williams, I kind of have an affection for Lamar Williams, but he sort of said, no, wait a minute, because he was trying to hold them off. He couldn't, they can't hold the priesthood yet. He's getting, the church isn't sure what to do about these people. But he didn't want this guy to abandon all of his wives for a church that was not necessarily going to accept them. So he held it off. He said, no, don't do anything rash right now, right? But eventually, after 78, obviously they had to renounce polygamy. But they hemmed and hawed a little bit about that until that time. Yes. That's a great question. I don't know. If they did, you're right, it wouldn't have come from there. But I don't know. It's interesting. I read through lots of the articles of faith and A Marvelous Work and a Wonder, partly to see what they said about women, because I was really curious. Could they have gotten from these texts? Does it say anything about the fact that women could not hold the priesthood? I couldn't find it. It's kind of assumed, I think, in those texts, but the language is such. It's sort of the language of the earlier in the 20th century, in the 1950s, where sometimes you use the term man to apply to both men and women, and sometimes you're really just talking about men, but you don't necessarily make that clear, and English speakers mostly get it from the context. But I kind of wondered as I was reading along, they don't see it. They may not see it, that this is supposed to be only for men, because no one comes right out and says, only men can be priesthood holders before that time. So that's why I wondered about Rebecca, whether she was just like, well, of course I can be a leader. Why not? It's just a curious, again, those assumptions we bring to our teachings. Yes? Yes.
They often put them with white companions or Utah companions. And now we've had a lot of African missionaries. Do you know if that system's working now?
Yes. Well, in the missionary training center in Accra, there are very few Americans. No American women. They cannot proselytize in certain parts of Africa. I asked a lot about that, like why, and the answer I was given, it's not safe. Yeah, I didn't sit in on the classes in the missionary training center, so I can't say for sure. I think in some ways there is an abundance of, now more and more older missionary couples that are around the seminary buildings and the training centers and working with these students, and I think they try to model it. I was really sort of amused sometimes by reading about we decided to throw a Halloween party for the young members of the church. Well, Halloween isn't, but what's Halloween? And but in a sense, that is a way of sort of acculturating them without really probably intending to. I think it was more just that's a nice thing you do for someone when you have a party. So I don't know that there is conscious acculturation to Utah cultural practices. But so much of what passes for Mormon practice, sometimes they shade into one another, and some people don't know. Well, is this a Mormon practice? Is this a Utah practice? What is this? So again, it's a little hard to sort out all of those things, but there are clearly lots of cues they're not getting. So, yes. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you have had a chance to get into any details regarding
That's a great question, Jill. I'm still trying to figure that out. And in fact, I have a date at the Church History Library on Saturday because I haven't been able to get in there for the last couple of years to keep digging into this. I haven't seen much about, like, when they talk about regularizing practices, mostly they're talking about expressive worship practices like the singing. You know, you can't dance on the tables. You know, you can't, I mean, and telling them why that's just, it's not orderly. But I haven't seen much, I mean, you're right about the speaking in tongues or the spirit-filled kinds of practices. Because in certain contexts, in certain, I think, Latter-day Saint contexts, people talk about the Spirit. You know, they may not mean the same thing by it, and it may look different, but I wonder how much of that is still occurring, actually, because there's language for it, even if the practices are look somewhat different. But I'm not really sure. That's a great question. Thank you. Was there another question? Yes, sir. A little bit, yeah. There are minutes from some of their meetings, and they held some conferences, some regional conferences and things like that. I think they tried as best they could, given the literature they had, to set up sort of a structure. But of course it was, and they did, as the Time magazine article noted, they had elders in the churches. Now what did that mean? Well, they weren't priesthood holders in any way that the Utah Church would have recognized. So it's a little unclear. They don't explain what that means by elders, but they had a leadership structure that probably they used the same any language they could find from the church to put together. It's just harder to know what that meant, practically speaking. I don't see much about a Relief Society in there, not until Rebecca Mold, comes along and they decide that's a good place for her to exercise her leadership. So, yeah, in the back. Yeah. I don't know if his journals tended to be sort of focused around his trips to Africa, but I haven't seen anything. I mean, other than his responses to the letters from India asking for instructional materials, haven't seen much more than that. I'll let you know if I do. Okay. Yes.
I was fascinated by your discussion of multiple religious belonging and the lack of exclusive membership. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that in terms of how that was dealt with by the Utah Church and whether that still continues.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it continues in the sense that, again, this scholar I talked to about it when I was there a few years ago said, if someone was raised Presbyterian, or if their family is Presbyterian, they might well say that they're Presbyterian if asked. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean necessarily they're going to a Presbyterian church. That means that that's where they're from. So, on paper, figuring out what people mean by those affiliations is really, really hard to do. And I probably would have to follow people around from the wards to know where they're going afterwards to really understand. I would bet it's more standardized, a lot more standardized now. I think that correlation, since 1978 has made a big difference. And the growth of native church leadership has changed that a lot. So I would suspect it's a little different now than it was, and not nearly as fluid in that regard. Let's see. Oh, there's a question here. Yes. Oh, one more question? Do I have time?
I think maybe one more
Okay.
question. We're kind of coming up on
Okay.
time.
I'm just interested to know if in this area of Africa that you're such a specialist in, have you run into
Yes. So first of all, I should say I'm not an expert in African history or culture. I'm an American historian. But when I was in Ghana, actually some of the missionary couples that I was hanging out with a lot talked about that problem, talked about the problem. People weren't getting married early because they had to earn enough money for the dowry. But they didn't describe it as a state problem. They described it as a custom, that you just didn't marry someone without the dowry money. There are government fees, but also I think that there are customs around giving money to family. So it probably, I mean, and it may be different by different countries, I just don't know. But the way they described it seemed to be more, this is just a custom that it's a local custom that they won't give up, rather than anything imposed upon them. But they definitely were trying to get people married younger. Yeah. So, are we? Yes, I think we're. Okay. Thank you all so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you.